The English Revolution, Part 3, Harrington and Filmer. The English Revolution was a practical success in search of a theory. The establishment of Commonwealth left Englishmen with a de facto republican regime in need of a theoretical justification. The Commonwealth, like Topsy, had just growed without anyone in particular setting out to make it. What was needed was an explanation of how it had come about without, as it were, anyone, or at least very few, actually desiring it. There is a real sense, writes Pocock, in which republican theories were a consequence, not a cause or even a precondition of the execution of the king and the temporary abolition of the monarchy. Of those who attempted to provide a theoretical grounding for the Commonwealth during its 10 or so years of existence, the most significant thinker was James Harrington. Harrington does not have the same name recognition as, say, Hobbes, his contemporary, but according to Sabine, he was a political philosopher of first-rate originality, not the equal of Hobbes in the bold sweep of his reasoning, but much his superior in the grasp of political realities. Harrington draws on the classical authors, in particular Plato, for many of his ideas. Nevertheless, he was an avowed admirer of Machiavelli, and followed Machiavelli's historical and comparative method, and his thought is permeated by a neo-Machiavellian realism. He wanted to know how the English parliamentary monarchy, the government of king, lords and commons, had come to collapse, and he wanted to know what should replace it. It's tempting to devote some space to the only other major attempt to provide a theoretical grounding for the Commonwealth, the excellency of a free state, written by the Machiavellian admiring journalist, erstwhile leveller, political hack, satirist, Cromwellian mouthpiece, and multiple turncoat, who went under the real but unlikely name of Marchmont Needham. But that is a temptation I must resist. Harrington's immediate practical influence was negligible, but theoretically he contributed two enduring ideas to the Republican debate. The first was that the structure of a government was ineluctably determined by the balance of dominion in the foundation, that is, by whom and by how many the material resources in a given state were controlled. The second idea was that a lasting solution to England's political problems has to be located in the government of laws rather than the government of men. What is perhaps most interesting about Harrington is that his account of the change from monarchy to republic is not couched in terms of pure ideas, as if the material, economic and social realities could be moulded into just any shape by the victor in a battle of ideas. Rather, he offered an explanation of the struggle between king and parliament as a revolution produced by the erosion of one political structure and the substitution of another through processes of long-term social change. The key to understanding Harrington's thought is to grasp that he saw government as being essentially determined by society's underlying social and economic forces. Some inkling of this is present in the thought of the Levellers and especially in the thought of Gerard Winstanley. Harrington, however, is the first to make this thesis explicit, a good 200 years before Karl Marx. The religious and political issues that drove the revolution were obvious enough. Lying a little deeper, however, was the fundamental change in social and economic conditions that had slowly and quietly taken place in the 16th and early 17th centuries. Harrington was perhaps the first person to note clearly this shift in economic power. The way in which property is distributed in a society, and by property Harrington meant ownership of land, has a profound effect on the kind of government that is possible. Those who control the land control the government. The Tudor dynasty had emerged from the internecine Wars of the Roses that had resulted in the destruction of the English nobility as a class that could effectively oppose the monarch. The king was no longer primus inter pares, that noble who, among other nobles, just happened to occupy the throne. After 1485, no one in England was in a position militarily to challenge the king. The estates of the great nobles were fragmented and the land allocated to a host of smaller landowners. Much the same thing happened under Henry VIII, this time with the landed estates of the church. The result in both cases was to distribute wealth among a numerous class of landowners from whom the demand for popular rights was certain sooner or later to arise. Harrington wrote in his A System of Politics, all government is interest, and the predominant interest gives the matter or foundation of government. If one man has the whole, or 2 parts in 3 of the whole land or territory, the interest of one man is the predominant interest, and causes absolute monarchy. If a few men have the whole, or 2 parts in 3 of the whole land or territory, the interest of the few or of the nobility is the predominant interest, and, were there any such thing in nature, would cause a pure aristocracy. If the many or the people have the whole, or 2 parts in 3 of the whole land or territory, the interest of the many or of the people is the predominant interest and causes democracy. If the government does not reflect the underlying economic realities, then one gets either a tyranny, an oligarchy, or anarchy. The Leveller's demand for a government based on laws was, remarks Gurney, famously taken up by James Harrington, whose 1656 work, The Commonwealth of Oceania, provided a detailed model of a system of government based on precisely this principle. According to Harrington, what distinguishes a commonwealth from all other forms of government is that it is a government of laws and not men. While Harrington agreed with Hobbes that all government is a matter of control, he did not agree with him in thinking it a matter of irrelevance what kind of control a government exercised. It is still the case that the essential distinction between tyrannical and legitimate government is that in the former, rule is exercised for the sake of the ruler, whereas in the latter, it is exercised for the sake of the ruled. All forms of government, writes Sabine, including the Commonwealth, require the coincidence of power with authority. No amount of wisdom can keep a government going smoothly unless the political power and economic power fall together. But it is equally true that government does not flow spontaneously from a given economic arrangement. Harrington agreed with Hobbes that there can be no power without the sword, but he adds to this the obvious but often ignored fact that swords must be paid for. As Hobbes said of the law that without the sword it is but paper, so he might have thought of this sword that without a hand it is but cold iron. The hand which is either an army in the field or ready for the field upon occasion. But an army is a beast that hath great belly, and must be fed. Wherefore this will come unto what pastures you have, and what pastures you have will come unto the balance of the property, without which the public sword is but a name or a mere spitfrog. If a commonwealth was to be established and preserved, then it was essential to prevent the accumulation of large estates, and equally essential to bring about the division of such large estates as already existed. What was the maximum number of landowners one would need in order to provide the economic basis for a commonwealth? Harrington estimated that number to be around 5,000, which, curiously, is more or less the same figure that Plato had given for the ideal number of citizens in his model city in his laws. Harrington proposed rotation in office, election by ballot, a written constitution, religious freedom, and a separation of powers. The separation of powers he proposed was not that which was to be proposed by Montesquieu, but a division between the power to propose legislation, the power to adopt it, and the power to execute it. Harrington's practical proposal envisages a complex system of indirect representation in which units would elect representatives to the next highest level, which level would then elect the representatives to the next higher level, and so on, giving us, from bottom to top, parishes, hundreds, tribes, and senate. On the point at issue between the Levellers and Ireton, Harrington came down on Ireton's side, and also, ironically, Winstanley's, believing it not to be possible to separate political rights from the rights of property. If the name of Sir Robert Filmer is known to students of political philosophy at all today, it will probably be as the source of provocation that led to John Locke's first treatise in government. The common estimation of Filmer is that he was something of a village idiot, putting forward a completely untenable theory of political obligation that Locke was able to dispatch with consummate ease. There are a number of problems with this estimate. First, if Filmer's views were so self-evidently idiotic, one can only wonder why Locke and others devoted so much time and attention to combating them. Second, on closer analysis, when one takes a look at what Filmer actually wrote, there are elements of his account that his critics appear not to have met in particular his arguments against the notion of contract as the foundation of political obligation. The basis of Filmer's positive account of political obligation depended upon his assimilation of political authority to paternal authority, taken together with a literalist and authoritarian reading of the Bible. Human society originated with Adam, to whom was given the whole world, all the land and everything on it. All creatures, human as well as non-human, were subject to his primal and patriarchal power. His successors to this day inherit this authority and have no need of the consent of those over whom they rule, any more than the father needs the consent of his children to his authority. It should be obvious why Filmer entitled his major work Patriarcha. The premises upon which Filmer's account were based were part of the common sense of his period, and so his argument had much more intuitive force then than it has now. Filmer's defence of patriarchalism as the ground of monarchy has proved an easy target for philosophers from Locke onwards. His argument is manifestly weak, the assimilation of political authority to paternal authority providing a very insecure foundation for the edifice it is required to support. Even if we were to grant its starting presuppositions, it also suffers from the irremediable defect of not being able to identify who the legitimate successor or successors to Adam are supposed to be. With a reasonably clear conscience, we can dismiss Filmer's positive argument. However, the critical side of Filmer's position, his attack on the doctrine of contract or consent, is a different animal altogether. Filmer was greatly influenced by the writings of Jean Bodin, not least Bodin's unitary conception of sovereignty. Royal power was intrinsically incapable of being participated in by any of the ruler's subjects. Moreover, Filmer maintained against the monarchomacs and some Catholic theorists such as Suarez and Bellarmine that no resistance of any kind to the king's rule could be in any way justified. As part of his effort to defend his positive account of the origin and nature of political obligation against attack, Filmer found it necessary to deflate those rival theories of the origin and justification of political obligation, in particular those theories that located it in the consent of the governed. For such theories made political authority both derivative and conditional. Before going into some detail in respect of Filmer's account, it might be useful to lay out the overall very simple structure of his argument. In effect, it comes to this. Any theory of political authority or political obligation that relies on the notion of contract or consent invariably leads, he thinks, to anarchy, by which he signifies chaos and disorder. Since anarchy is eminently undesirable, so too is the theory of consent which leads to it. Filmer begins by attacking the idea that men are by nature free and equal. Within the last 100 years, he writes, many of the schoolmen and other divines have published and maintained an opinion that mankind is naturally endowed and born with freedom from all subjection, and that liberty to choose what form of government it please, and that the power which any one man hath over others was at the first by human right bestowed according to the discretion of the multitude. It is bad enough that such an horrendous idea should be entertained by papists, but it is even worse when some eminent divines in the Reformed churches come to the same conclusion. Whatever may be the convergence of Catholic and Protestant thought on this matter, Filmer believes it to be in contradiction to the history and doctrine of the Scriptures, the constant practice of all ancient monarchies, and the very principles of the law of nature. From this doctrine of the natural freedom and equality of all, there flows inexorably the right of a people to resist their ruler. As might be expected, Filmer refers to the passages in Romans 13 and to 1 Peter 2 to support his claim. But he also appeals to Samuel 8 in a surprising fashion. Most interpreters take the Samuel passage as demonstrating a less than enthusiastic divine acquiescence in the Israelites' request for a king. Filmer, by contrast, takes the purpose of this passage as being to teach the people a dutiful obedience to their king, even in those things which themselves did esteem mischievous and inconvenient. For by telling them what a king would do, he instructs them what a subject must suffer. Yet not that it is right for kings to do injury, but it is right for them to go unpunished by the people if they do it. When it comes to the topic of consent or contract, Filmer points out that there is no record of any government ever beginning in this way, a point later made by Hume. Furthermore, even if, despite the manifold practical difficulties amounting almost to an impossibility, all people were to agree at some particular moment, why should the consent of new additions not be required at another particular time? A point that was to be echoed by Thomas Jefferson in a letter to James Madison some 150 years later, when he wrote, "It may be proved that no society can make a perpetual constitution, or even a perpetual law. The earth belongs always to the living generation. They may manage it then, and what proceeds from it, as they please, during their usufruct. They are masters too of their own persons, and consequently may govern them as they please. But persons and property make the sum of the objects of government. The constitution and the laws of their predecessors are extinguished then in their natural course with those who gave them being." To assist in the comprehension of his argument, Jefferson came up with a remarkable thought experiment. He imagined the earth populated by generations of men, all of the same age, that died together just at the moment that the next generation attained maturity. He writes, "Let us suppose a whole generation of men to be born on the same day, to attain mature age on the same day, and to die on the same day, leaving succeeding generation in the moment of attaining their mature age altogether. One discrete generation would then follow another with no overlap." He invited Madison to consider and respond to his arguments. Madison's response to Jefferson relies on that old perennial tacit consent. "I find no relief from these consequences," writes Madison, "but in the received doctrine that a tacit consent may be given to establish constitutions and laws, and that this assent may be inferred where no positive dissent appears. May it not be questioned whether it be possible to exclude wholly the idea of tacit consent without subverting the foundation of civil society. Without such tacit consent, political society might well be subverted, but we have no reason to think that civil society would likewise fail, unless we make the classic mistake of conflating the civil and the political orders." Filmer, of course, rejects the whole notion of tacit consent or consent by proxy, and also the idea that the consent of one's progenitors can bind their descendants. Filmer again. "If it were lawful for particular parts of the world by consent to choose their kings, nevertheless their elections would bind none to subjection, but only such as consented. For the major part never binds, but where men at first either agree to be so bound, or where a higher power so commands. Were it to be argued that the votes of parents can go proxy for their children, then farewell the doctrine of the natural freedom of mankind. Where subjection of children to parents is natural, there can be no natural freedom." The core of Filmer's argument was that if the natural freedom and equality of all were to be granted, then it would never have been possible for any government to get started, or, if mirabile dictu, to get started to be maintained. Natural freedom and equality leads straight to anarchy. George H. Smith writes, "Filmer challenged consent theorists to show how any sovereign government can be justified if we begin with the supposition that people are naturally free and equal. He repeatedly asserted that the doctrine of natural liberty and equality, which was commonly called upon to limit the powers of government, actually destroys the foundation of government itself, and will land us in anarchy instead. Those who begin their political reasoning with a state of nature, a society without political authority, or dominion in which every person enjoys equal rights, are logically doomed to remain in that anarchistic condition. If such universal unanimity is not required in order to set up a king, and a part of the whole may legitimately do so, why should not a part of the whole have a similar power? Indeed, why should it not be possible for every man to be his own king? Anarchy again. Since nature hath not distinguished the habitable world into kingdoms, nor determined what part of a people shall belong to one kingdom and what to another, it follows that the original freedom of meaning being supposed, every man is at liberty to be of what kingdom he please, and so every petty colony hath a right to make a kingdom by itself, and not only every city, but every village, and every family, nay, and every particular man a liberty to choose himself to be his own king if he please. and he were a madman, that being by nature free, would choose any man but himself to be his own governor. Thus, to avoid the having but of one king of the whole world, we shall run into a liberty of having as many kings as there be men in the world, which upon the matter is to have no king at all, but leave all men to their natural liberty, which is the mischief the pleaders for natural liberty do pretend they would most avoid. Despite the obscurity into which most political theorists cast him, George H. Smith is prepared to put Filmer on a list of the most influential political philosophers of the modern era, on foot of his penetrating criticism of the theory of consent. Filmer's arguments, in one form or another, will be repeated by those such as David Hume and Edmund Burke, who reject contract or consent theories as the source of legitimate political authority. Summary. In the 17th century, the new technology of printing made the production and dissemination of pamphlets and controversial literature possible in people's vernacular language. At least 20,000 pamphlets were published in England between 1640 and 1660. At this time in England, religious and political differences came to a head. In the late 1640s, a semi-organised group emerged which was known pejoratively as the Levellers because of its presumed intent to flatten all social and religious hierarchies. Prominent in this group were John Lilburne, William Walwyn and Richard Overton. More radical than the Levellers were those called the Diggers, whose controversial literature appears in the main to have been written by Gerard Winstanley. The Levellers object to legally created and legally maintained monopolies, the effective monopoly of political power by the nobility and gentry, the economic monopolies enjoyed by the merchants, and the professional monopolies enjoyed by lawyers. The Levellers argued that our rulers, leaders, governors have rightful powers over us only to the extent that we have given it to them. Such power as they have only for the purpose of our benefit, acting as our agents while we remain principals, and they have it only so long as they act for our benefit. In the Putney debates, the Leveller position was that those who are permanently to be affected by law should have a say in choosing their lawmakers. On the other hand, Harrington's position was that those who pay the bills should have the final say over what bills are to be paid. What seems to have occurred to neither party was that the problem lies somewhat deeper than either supposes, and that the whole notion of representation is suspect. Overton's arrow against all tyrants introduced the notion of a property in oneself many years before Locke. The Levellers were concerned with political reform first and foremost, and with economic reform only in a subsidiary way. The Diggers' programme was a reappropriation by the poor of much of the land of England. They were concerned with political reform by economic means. Winstanley understood that state power is related to the property system, so that, in his view, political freedom cannot be had without substantial economic equality, and that, in turn, requires the abolition of private property. 200 years before Marx, James Harrington saw government as being essentially determined by society's underlying social and economic forces. Robert Filmer anticipated many arguments against the idea that government is based on contract. He denied that there is a record of any government ever beginning by contract or consent. He rejected the whole notion of tacit consent or consent by proxy, and also the idea that the consent of one's progenitors can bind their descendants. The core of Filmer's argument is that if men are naturally free and equal, it would never have been possible for any government to get started or to be maintained. Natural freedom and equality leads straight to anarchy.